You probably saw the headline and thought you understood the story. The United States approved an 11 billion arms package for Taiwan. China responded with sanctions, another round in the endless cycle of great power posturing. But if that is where you stopped, you missed what actually happened here. Because this is not just about weapon sales or diplomatic retaliation. This is about the fundamental breakdown of the assumptions that have governed US-China relations for decades, and the consequences of that breakdown are only beginning to reveal themselves. I want to walk through this carefully because the surface narrative is designed to make you comfortable with a simple framing. The United States is supporting a democratic ally. China is overreacting aggressively, and everything will settle back into manageable tension. But when you look at the details, when you examine who got sanctioned and why, when you follow the economic logic rather than the political rhetoric, you see something far more serious unfolding. Here is what officially happened. The Biden administration approved the largest arms package in history for Taiwan, 1 billion in advanced weapon systems, fighter aircraft, submarine technology, missile defense systems, surveillance equipment, and precision-guided munitions. The package still requires congressional approval, but that approval is virtually guaranteed given the current political climate. The stated justification is familiar. Taiwan faces increasing military pressure from Beijing. The United States has obligations under the Taiwan Relations Act, and deterrence requires credible capability, all of which sounds reasonable if you accept the framing that this is about defending democracy against authoritarian aggression. China's response was immediate and unprecedented in its specificity. Sanctions against 20 American defense companies, sanctions against 10 individual executives by name, asset freezes, property seizures, entry bans into China, and prohibitions on Chinese companies doing any business with the sanctioned entities. Now, here is where most coverage stops. It treats the sanctions as symbolic, as political theater meant for domestic consumption, as China making noise, but ultimately lacking the leverage to actually hurt American interests. This interpretation is dangerously wrong. Look at the list of sanctioned companies: Boeing, Northrop, Grumman, L3 Harris, Advanced Acoustics Concepts, VSSE Corporation, Sierra Technical, Red Cat, Teal Drones, High Point Aeronautics, Epirus Dunn. These are not peripheral players. These are core nodes in the American defense industrial complex companies with billions in existing contracts with China and Chinese partners, companies with supply chains that run through Chinese manufacturing companies with technology partnerships that depend on Chinese cooperation. But the list is even more revealing when you look at what each company does and why China targeted them specifically. Boeing is obvious. It is the largest American aerospace company with massive commercial exposure to China, has ordered over $140 billion dollars in Boeing aircraft over the past decade. Those orders represent thousands of jobs at Boeing facilities across the United States and in the supplier network that feeds into Boeing production. When China says Boeing is sanctioned, it is not just punishing the company, it is threatening an entire ecosystem of American manufacturing employment in politically sensitive states that matter in elections. This is economic leverage being deployed with surgical precision. Northrop Grumman operates differently. Its exposure is not commercial aircraft, but advanced technology partnerships in satellite systems and autonomous vehicles in cybersecurity infrastructure. China has been a partner, not an adversary, in some of these civilian applications. Sanctioning Northrop cuts off technology flows that benefited both sides, but hurts Northrop more because it loses access to Chinese technical expertise in areas like artificial intelligence and quantum computing, where China is now competitive or even leading. L3 Harris Technologies represents another vulnerability. This is a company that merged specifically to compete in advanced defense electronics, communication systems, surveillance technology, and integrated battlefield networks. Much of their supply chain depends on Chinese rare earth materials, on Chinese electronic components, and on Chinese manufacturing capacity for commercial products that subsidize their defense work. Sanctioning L3 Harris does not just hurt their Taiwan contracts, it threatens their entire cost structure if they cannot source components from China. They have to find alternatives that are more expensive, less reliable, or simply do not exist at scale. Now look at the smaller companies. Red Cat, Teal Drones, Done. These are drone manufacturers critical to the future of warfare. China is sending a message that it can target not just the legacy defense giants, but the emerging technology firms that represent the future of American military advantage. Red Cat makes small tactical drones used for reconnaissance and surveillance. Teal Drones specializes in counter-drone technology. DD Drone provides anti-drone defense systems. These companies exist at the intersection of commercial and military technology. They sell to police departments, to private security firms, and to defense contractors. Sanctioning them threatens not just their military sales, but their entire business model, because they often rely on Chinese components, Chinese manufacturing partners, and Chinese consumer markets to achieve the scale that makes their military products affordable. This is the genius of China's targeting strategy. It is not just hitting the companies involved in the Taiwan arms sale. It is hitting companies whose business models depend on Chinese economic integration to remain viable advanced acoustics concepts. Sierra Technical VSSE Corporation. These are niche players in submarine technology, underwater sensors, and naval systems. Exactly the capabilities China is most concerned about in any Taiwan scenario by sanctioning them. China is not just retaliating. It is gathering intelligence about American supply chain vulnerabilities in critical military technologies. It is forcing these companies to choose between Chinese commercial opportunities and American military contracts. And it is creating case studies that will inform future economic warfare strategies. When China says these companies are prohibited from doing business in or with China, that is not symbolic. That is a direct hit to their revenue streams, their supply chain access, and their long-term growth strategies. Let me make this concrete. Boeing has been trying for years to expand its market share in China, one of the fastest growing aviation markets in the world. China has been ordering hundreds of aircraft worth tens of billions of dollars. Those orders are now in jeopardy, not officially canceled, but indefinitely delayed pending resolution of this dispute. Northrop Grumman has partnerships with Chinese firms in satellite technology, in advanced materials, and aerospace engineering. Those partnerships are now frozen. The knowledge transfer stops the joint venture's halt, and the future opportunities evaporate. L3 Harris has supply chain dependencies, components manufactured in China, rare earth materials sourced from Chinese suppliers, technical expertise that exists nowhere else at comparable cost. Disrupting those relationships does not just raise costs, it threatens the ability to deliver on existing contracts on schedule and on budget. This is not theoretical economic pressure. This is immediate material damage to the profitability and operational capacity of major American corporations that employ hundreds of thousands of American workers, corporations whose stock prices affect millions of retirement accounts, corporations whose lobbying power shapes American foreign policy. Now think about the precedent. This sets for decades the United States operated on a convenient fiction that economic engagement with China and military containment of China could proceed on separate tracks, that American companies could profit from the Chinese market while the American military prepared for potential conflict. China is now saying that fiction is over. If you want to arm Taiwan and prepare for military confrontation, then you cannot simultaneously expect to profit from economic cooperation. You have to choose. And here is what makes this moment dangerous. American policy has not adjusted to this new reality. The political system still operates as if economic and security policy exists in separate silos. The defense establishment pushes for armed sales without consulting the economic team about the commercial consequences. The business community lobbies for market access without acknowledging the security tensions that make that access politically toxic. This disconnect creates a doom loop. Security hawks push for more weapons, sales to demonstrate resolve and support allies. China responds with economic sanctions that hurt American commercial interests. American companies lobby for de-escalation, which makes the United States look weak, which emboldens security hawks to push for even more aggressive postures. And the cycle continues with each iteration, raising the stakes. The sanctions against individual executives adds another layer of complexity that most coverage completely ignores. These are not faceless bureaucrats. These are named individuals with families and personal assets, with global business interests, and with reputations to protect. Palmer Luckey, founder of Anduril, is a billionaire tech entrepreneur who built Oculus VR and sold it to Facebook before pivoting to defense technology. His company, Anduril, represents the new generation of defense contractors using commercial technology and Silicon Valley methods to disrupt traditional defense procurement sanctioning. Lucky personally sends a message to every other tech entrepreneur considering a move into defense work. It says, your personal wealth, your freedom of movement, and your global business opportunities will be at risk if you participate in weapons systems that threaten Chinese interests. John Candelon, Vice President at L3Harris, Michael Canaville, CEO of Advanced Acoustic Concepts, Mitch McDonald, President of Teal Drones. These are senior executives at mid-tier defense firms, people who probably never imagined that their day-to-day work would result in personal sanctions from a foreign government. Now they cannot travel to China, they cannot do business there, their personal assets are frozen, and their families face restrictions they did not choose. Think about the chilling effect this creates throughout the industry. If you are a talented engineer or business executive considering a career in defense, you now have to calculate the personal geopolitical risk of working on certain programs. Will working on Taiwan-related systems make you personally sanctionable by China for life? Will developing counter-Chinese technologies restrict your ability to travel, to do business internationally, or to participate in global commerce? These are not trivial concerns for people building careers that might span decades. The defense industry already struggles to compete with commercial tech for top talent because the pay is often lower, the bureaucracy is worse, and the innovation cycles are slower. Now add personal geopolitical risk to that equation, and the talent disadvantage becomes even more severe. Anuan Roy, founder of Diamond Power, Dan Smoot, CEO of Van Topadisha, Devorakanda, CEO of Dido Ann Wood, president of High Point Aeronautics, Jay Hoffledge, co-founder of Reconnaissance Boat. These are entrepreneurs who built companies around specific defense applications. Their personal sanctions affect not just them, but everyone who works for them, every investor who backed them, and every partner who collaborated with them. Chinese companies are now prohibited from doing business with any entity these people lead that extends beyond just the sanctioned companies. If Palmer Luckey starts a new venture, even in a completely different sector, Chinese firms cannot work with it. If Mitch McDonald joins another company as an advisor or board member, that company's China relationships become complicated. This creates a permanent stigma that follows these individuals throughout their careers. It is personal targeting designed to make an example that will influence thousands of other decisions by other executives considering similar choices. And here is what makes it effective. Unlike government officials who are used to sanctions and see them as part of the job, so these are private sector executives who built businesses in a globalized economy. They are accustomed to free movement of capital, free movement of people, and the ability to do business anywhere in the world. Being personally sanctioned fundamentally disrupts their understanding of how the world works. It forces them to choose between American strategic priorities and their personal economic interests, and it makes that choice visible to everyone else in their industry. China is effectively weaponizing the global nature of modern business. American executives travel internationally. They hold assets in multiple jurisdictions. They participate in global supply chains, making them personally vulnerable to foreign government sanctions, creates a chilling effect that goes far beyond the immediate companies involved. Now, let's talk about the economic logic behind China's response, because this is not emotional retaliation. This is calculated strategy. China is demonstrating that it has economic leverage that can inflict real costs on American strategic choices. For years, American policymakers operated on the assumption that China needed access to American technology and markets more than America needed access to Chinese manufacturing and consumers. That assumption is now obsolete. China has built domestic alternatives to many American technologies. It has developed supply chains that can function without American components. It has created consumer markets large enough to support entire industries. Domestically, the balance of dependency has shifted when China sanctions Boeing. It signals that it can source aircraft from European manufacturers like Airbus or accelerate development of domestic alternatives like Comarmac. When it sanctions defense contractors, it demonstrates that it no longer needs American defense technology partnerships because it has developed indigenous capabilities. This is the deeper story hiding beneath the sanctions. China is announcing that the era of asymmetric dependence is over, that it now has options, and that American companies can be excluded from Chinese markets without catastrophic consequences for China's economy. The 11 billion arms package becomes the trigger for China to demonstrate this new reality. It is not that the arms themselves represent an existential threat. China's military is large enough and sophisticated enough to handle Taiwan's defenses, regardless of American support. The real issue is precedent. If the United States can sell 11 billion in weapons this year, it can sell 15 billion next year and 20 billion the year after, and each sale normalizes a trajectory toward formal separation between Taiwan and mainland China, something Beijing has declared a red line that cannot be crossed. From China's perspective, the arms sales are not defensive support for a democratic ally. They are incremental steps toward permanent division of what China considers its sovereign territory. You do not have to agree with China's position on Taiwan to understand the strategic logic. Imagine if a foreign power was arming a separatist movement in a region the United States considered part of its territory, and doing so with explicit government backing and billions in advanced weapons. The American response would likely be far more aggressive than targeted economic sanctions. This context matters because it reveals how differently the two sides understand what is happening from the American perspective. This is about defending democracy and honoring commitments from the Chinese perspective. This is about territorial integrity and preventing foreign interference in internal affairs. Both narratives have internal logic. Both are supported by historical claims, and both are incompatible with the other side's position. This is what makes the situation so dangerous. There is no shared framework for resolving the underlying dispute. The sanctions are China's way of raising the cost of American policy choices without triggering military escalation. It is economic warfare in the most literal sense, using market access and supply chain leverage as weapons to achieve political goals. And here is the uncomfortable truth. It is working. American defense contractors are already lobbying Congress to reconsider Taiwan policy, not because they oppose supporting Taiwan, but because the commercial costs are becoming unsustainable. Boeing's stock price dropped immediately after the sanctions were announced. Northrop Grumman faced questions from investors about exposure to Chinese markets. L3Harris issued statements trying to reassure stakeholders that the impact would be manageable. But manageable today becomes unmanageable tomorrow if the sanctions persist, if they expand, and if other countries follow China's lead in using economic leverage to punish American security policy choices. We are watching the emergence of a bifurcated global system where economic integration and security competition can no longer coexist peacefully, where companies have to choose between Chinese markets and American strategic priorities, where supply chains have to be reorganized around political allegiances rather than economic efficiency. This bifurcation will be expensive. It will raise costs for consumers. It will reduce efficiency for producers. It will slow innovation, and it will create vulnerabilities that did not exist in a more integrated world. But the momentum towards separation seems unstoppable. Now, each escalation makes cooperation harder. Each sanction creates constituencies that benefit from continued division. Each weapons sale generates a bureaucratic interest in justifying further sales. The $11 billion arms package is not just a transaction. It is a milestone on a path towards something resembling a new Cold War, but with far deeper economic entanglement than existed between the United States and the Soviet Union. That entanglement makes this moment more dangerous, not less, because the costs of conflict are much higher. But the mechanisms for managing tension are much weaker. During the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union had minimal economic ties. Trade between the two superpowers was negligible. There were no integrated supply chains, no joint ventures, no mutual investment. The economies operated in almost complete isolation. This made military competition relatively clean. You could sanction the Soviet Union without affecting American corporate profits. You could engage in arms races without disrupting American supply chains. You could pursue containment strategies without threatening American jobs. The decoupling was already complete. So Cold War policies did not require decoupling. They just maintained separation that already existed today. The situation is inverted. American companies have trillions invested in China. Apple relies on Chinese manufacturing for virtually all its products. Tesla builds cars in Shanghai for global markets. Boeing depends on Chinese orders to maintain production scale. Walmart sources hundreds of billions in goods from Chinese suppliers. Millions of American jobs depend on Chinese supply chains. Entire industries exist only because of Chinese manufacturing capacity. Entire regions of the United States have economies built around importing Chinese goods or exporting to Chinese markets. Unwinding that integration while maintaining economic growth and political stability is extraordinarily difficult, possibly impossible, without accepting a significant reduction in living standards, particularly for working-class Americans who benefit most from cheap Chinese goods and who have the least ability to absorb price increases. Yet the political pressure for decoupling continues to grow on both sides. In the United States, China is increasingly seen as a strategic threat that requires confrontation, regardless of economic cost. There is bipartisan consensus that dependence on China is a vulnerability that must be reduced in China. The United States is increasingly seen as a declining power trying to prevent China's rise through economic and military containment. Chinese leadership believes that American policy is fundamentally hostile, designed to keep China weak and prevent it from reclaiming what they view as its rightful place in the global order. Both narratives are self-reinforcing and both create incentives for more aggressive behavior. When you believe your adversary is fundamentally hostile, you interpret every action through that lens. Arms sales become preparation for war. Economic sanctions become acts of aggression, and defensive measures become offensive threats. This mutual suspicion creates a security dilemma where actions taken for defense are perceived as threatening, which prompts counteractions that confirm the original suspicion. The spiral becomes self-perpetuating, each side gathering evidence that confirms its worst fears about the other side's intentions. The sanctions against American executives also raise troubling questions about the future of global business if executives can be personally targeted for implementing their company's strategy or their government's policy. That creates enormous uncertainty for international commerce. Will executives stop traveling to countries where they might face sanctions? Will companies stop pursuing politically sensitive contracts? Will the talent pool for defense work shrink as people calculate the personal risks? These are not hypothetical concerns. They are already happening. Executives are reconsidering travel plans, companies are reassessing their China exposure, and talented engineers are choosing commercial tech over defense work to avoid personal geopolitical risk. The long-term consequences of this fragmentation are difficult to predict, but unlikely to be positive. Global problems like climate change, pandemic preparedness, and nuclear non-proliferation require cooperation between the United States and China. If economic relations continue to deteriorate, if sanctions and counter-sanctions become the new normal, if personal targeting of executives becomes standard practice, that cooperation becomes functionally impossible. You cannot coordinate on global challenges while simultaneously conducting economic warfare. The trust required for cooperation is incompatible with the hostility generated by sanctions. So where does this leave us with an 11 billion arms package that may never be fully delivered? Because the companies involved face sanctions that make execution difficult, with Chinese markets increasingly closed to American firms that participated in the transaction, with American executives personally targeted and restricted in their global mobility, and with precedents established that will shape future crises in ways we cannot yet predict. The immediate winners are the defense contractors who book the revenue even if delivery becomes complicated, and the politicians who can claim they stood up to China, even if the actual strategic benefit is questionable. The immediate losers are American workers at companies now sanctioned by China. American consumers who will pay higher prices as supply chains reorganize, and American executives who face personal restrictions for implementing policy. They did not make the long-term consequences or harder to assess, but almost certainly negative. We are moving toward a world of competing economic blocks, reduced efficiency, higher costs, and greater risk of miscalculation and conflict. The 11 billion arms sale will be remembered not for the weapons it provided, but for the path it accelerated toward economic and strategic bifurcation between the world's two largest economies. And the tragedy is there were always alternatives, diplomatic frameworks that could have managed the Taiwan issue without militarizing it further. Economic engagement strategies that could have created mutual stakes in stability rather than mutual threats of disruption.